Jake Fisher, author of a new book, which I am highly intrigued by. Being in the Philadelphia market, Jake, we are all very intrigued by the topic of your book. We're going to get into it. It's called Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. And the author, Jake Fisher, pre-order it now. It publishes on May the 4th. He joins us to take a look at it. There it is. He's got a copy in his hand for those of you watching on the stream. What's going on, Jake?
How you doing, man? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Obviously, in this market, I wonder, when you come up with Built to Lose, what's the team that stands out that kind of started this tanking era? Is there one?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's Sam Hinkie's process Sixers. I'm from Philadelphia originally, from Cherry Hill. I went to more games than I can count as a kid. I'm wearing an Eagles hat right now. I'm not a Sixers fan anymore. Like, covering the league full time for almost a decade now, that kind of bleeds out of you. But I came up writing for Liberty Ballers at SB Nation, covering that team in the throes of it. I think I joined a little after Hinkie got hired, that May 2013. And I also went to school in Boston. I was covering the Celtics, who people forget at the same time, same night, Hinkie traded Drew Holiday to New Orleans in order to get back Nerlens Noel and that 2014 first-round pick. The Celtics also traded KG and Paul Pierce to start their rebuild, and they tanked a year to get high up in that 2014 draft class. And it really happened all around the league. Phoenix, Orlando, Sacramento, Cleveland, Minnesota. We saw a lot of other analytical executives, just like Sam Hinkie, rise to power and kind of try to copy the Oklahoma City Thunder model and kind of outlast the Heat's Big Three era and be that next version of the Thunder once maybe LeBron kind of slipped out of his prime a little bit.
So, the Sixers make that move, and they went on like a 3-year journey almost of tanking.
They did.
Would you say they did it better than others? Was it their intention to do what they did? Like, when you look at what they did others follow suit of what they were doing? Did they do their own little thing? Like, how would you kind of describe what Sam Hinkie and the Sixers kind of started, or what they did?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really think, and I've been explaining the book as kind of like an anecdotal history and kind of a comparing and contrasting of how all these different teams did it, being that there is no one way to build a franchise correctly. There's too much luck involved. We just saw, unfortunately, what happened with Jamal Murray last night, tearing his ACL, right? Like, the Nuggets have done pretty much every move perfectly, right down to this latest big swing with Aaron Gordon. Sure enough, Jamal Murray tears his knee apart, and who knows what the future in Denver now holds. It's the same thing with all these teams. A lot of them just didn't get all the way to where Denver, where Philly are now. I think what Sam did and what Philly did differently from Boston, from Orlando, definitely from Phoenix, that Suns team in 2013-14 was actually supposed to be worse than Hinkie's Sixers before they became a playoff contender. What the Sixers did was tank year after year after year, like you mentioned. They originally were going to try and bounce back quicker than anticipated, but I think the plan with people it gets misconstrued. Hinkie wasn't always just going to draft injured players. The plan, like we talked about, it gets changed. There's luck involved. It just so happened that Joel Embiid fell to them at 3 the year after they took Nerlens Noel. And we all can look back right now. Andrew Wiggins, Jabari Parker went 1 and 2. Other guys on top of that class. The reason the Sixers are even being asked by you, Mike, as the best case scenario of this tanking era is because they got Joel Embiid. So I think the one thing that they definitely did differently was the longitude of it. But at the same time, if they don't get Joel, if the Cavs take him, whatever, there's so many different pivot points on any team's rebuilding process.
Jake Fisher, the book's called Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. And when you talk to executives, I saw this, by the way, I want to bring up the cover of the book. The ping pong balls have the different pictures, and I said, there is one of the Sixers, but it's way back there. The Sixers should be the one that's right. I see it.
Right here in the corner.
It's in the corner.
Yeah, there's another one, too.
Yeah, the Sixers.
Yeah, the cover, not to interrupt, the cover is based off of the lottery from 2014 that we were just talking about with Joel.
Gotcha.
And this is the order. The Cavs went 1, the Bucks went 2, the Phillies 3. That number 10 is the pick we just talked about. that they got back from New Orleans, which, they sent Dr. J to the podium that year
Yeah.
for him to be the representative. And, when 10 comes up on the clock, I don't know if you remember, the ESPN broadcast zoomed in on Dr. J's face. He had his brow scrunched. He was so confused. And he didn't know. He went to New York only knowing they had a top 3 pick. So he called it what the bleep moment
That's
to me
right.
because he literally had no idea. He went on national TV and had no clue the Sixers were going to get that second pick that year.
That's right. That's a good point. So good context there as to the order of these ping pong balls. So you spoke to a bunch of executives and kind of got a account of the modern team building.
Yes.
Is the NBA, I don't want to say universal, but are more executives and teams willing to go this route now because of the way the Sixers came out the other side of this? They didn't win a championship, but I think it'd be argued that they are more relevant now than any time in their history, maybe other than, 83 winning a championship and, going back into the early days. But people care more about the Sixers now than ever before. So are teams more willing to bite the bullet, lose a couple years because of what the Sixers and others have done?
So again, the big difference in what Philly did from other teams, right, was the years-long effort, that brazen effort to say we're going to punt multiple seasons. I don't know if that's going to continue, where teams will be porous intentionally for, the better part of a couple of years to stack guys together. But we are seeing it right now. I mean, this year's draft is considered to be the richest draft class since that 2014 class we were just talking about, with Cade Cunningham and Jalen Suggs. We all saw in the NCAA tournament, Evan Mobley, other guys down in the G League Ignite team. And we've seen the Houston Rockets, they move on from James Harden, and they're going to be bad for a little while now here, trying to recoup some talent through the draft. The Oklahoma City Thunder did the same with Russell Westbrook and then Paul George. And they have, 17 first-round picks in the next 7 years or something crazy like that. The Orlando Magic just pieced off Nikola Vucevic, Aaron Gordon, Evan Fournier at the trade deadline. A lot of teams are playing the draft right now. This is definitely a pretty open attempt to try to, position yourself in the lottery, get a high pick. The difference is with the way that, they reformed the lottery structure based off of what Hinkie Sixers did. Now the bottom 3 teams only have a 14% chance rather than the worst team having a 25% chance. Time will still tell if teams are willing to do this now for, 3+ seasons. But the benefits, no matter what, as the lottery reform stands, as we're seeing with Houston and OKC and Orlando and even Detroit, like tanking for at least a year, that is definitely in vogue still.
Right. And I guess from talking to these executives and people in the league, do they understand now that their fans are also willing to embrace it? Because part of the problem, Jake, would be we were growing up as kids in the 90s and 80s. These are businesses. We can't lose. We got to get people to come here. But the ownership groups are now almost saying our fans are on board with this, so go and give you the green light to do it.
Yeah, you talk to any executive in the league right now, and they're very well aware of NBA Twitter and the conversations and how, not just the offseason speculation of which player is going to be a good team with this guy. Fans are talking about executives now just as much as they are about players. They're talking about guys' draft records and transaction logs, and they know they feel the pressure to win the deal, get instantly graded as the guy who got one over on the guy running the other front office. And that is a complete reflection on these decisions at large of how to build a team forward too. And you're right, ownership at the end of the day does play the biggest factor. Like the Rockets, they didn't want to try to move off of Harden earlier. They also could have gotten better deals for PJ Tucker or Victor Oladipo or other pieces. But they had, I talked to executives with that team, with other teams who have talked about how that ownership group of Tim Fertitta really has a huge stronghold on a lot of those decision-making. So it's a real factor for sure.
Jake, what does the league think about this? Built to lose, how the NBA's tanking era changed the league forever. What does the NBA think about losing being the best remedy to try to win?
It's a problem. I mean, we're seeing it right now with those teams I just talked about. I mean, it's a combination of the COVID season, all these back-to-backs, but we're seeing 40-point, 50-point losses on the regular here. And that's when a lot of teams, they're resting guys like Al Horford with the Thunder just kind of agreed to not play with them anymore this season, which, we were having this whole controversy a couple of years ago about the Spurs resting stars on national TV nights. And the Pelicans were getting fined for benching Anthony Davis when he wanted out of New Orleans. And they didn't want him to get hurt for trade value. There's definitely executives and people in the league office that I've talked to who are kind of throwing up their hands and saying, this is definitely we want to be encouraging this. No, this is a problem. So I don't know where we go from here. I really think the only opportunity to change this truly is, Mike Zarin with the Boston Celtics said this to me, and he repeats it all the time. The only way to truly eliminate tanking is to get rid of the draft order being dependent on the inverse of the standings. If there was some type of arbitrary system like the wheel that Mike Zarin proposed, where you're in a bracket of 5 teams every year, and there's a little lotteries in those realms, that's something that I think could be interesting. This play-in tournament is getting brought up right now by Luka Doncic because the Mavs are a little bit complainy that they're going to have to play in it. I think it's a great idea. There's been talk in years past about putting all the teams that don't make the playoffs into their own tournament to have them compete for the number 1 pick. I think that'd be interesting, but then you would see teams probably tank out of the playoffs to get into that tournament. So it's just kind of figuring out what the ripple effects would be.
Right, and I've always said on my show, in my fantasy football league, we did this because teams stopped turning their lineups in. So what we did was, if you finished the first place out of the money, you got the first selection of where you wanted to pick the next year. So it encouraged teams that keep winning and keep hey, we don't want to sit out Al Horford. We want to keep winning. We might finish 8th. Well, that gets us the 3rd best opportunity. I don't think that would ever be the case, but they got to figure something out because they are rewarding. Like you mentioned, the play-in tournament, well, teams might lose. You're not tanking the whole damn season, though. You might lose a game or 2 to say, we don't really want to be the 8th seed, but you're not making a mockery of the whole year.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's a much better, pill to swallow. And I think there'd be ways to be creative about it, right? Like you could make it a double elimination type situation where you have to win your first game and then you move along, and then you could get some double. I mean, there's so many different facets they could make it happen. I think it'd be great. It would probably be a money revenue thing. I mean, imagine if during the shows in the Philadelphia market, imagine if obviously the process era galvanized a huge portion of that fan base, right? The Rights to Ricky Sanchez podcast guys have this lottery party every year. They get thousands of people going to Xfinity Live. Imagine if the Nerlens Noel, KJ McDaniels, Jeremy Grant process Sixers got into a postseason tournament to win that number 1 pick at the Wells Fargo Center. That place would have been going nuts. I think any owner, any league official would be pretty happy with the gate prices that could get off something like that.
That's true. Jake Fisher, the book is called Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. You can pre-order it now. It comes out on May the 4th. It's perfect for that first weekend at the beach down here at the Jersey Shore. Just sit in the beach chair.
I'll be in Ventnor.
All right. That's where I'm from. All right. So, Jake, give me a story, an example of something that you mentioned in the description of the book. It talks about feuding between agents and executives and these surprise. Like, give me something that you were like, wow, this thing has really taken over the league.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring it to Philly because obviously this is the market we're talking about right now. And, when Sam came in and took over that organization, it was definitely still towards the beginning of analytics sweeping the industry, like you talked about. And there was kind of like a line in the sand, whether you were a basketball guy or an analytics guy. And, the Sixers had this analytics guy in the early era, named Aaron Barzilay, who was around. And when the Sixers ownership group, this Josh Harris, David Blitzer group, bought the team, they were curious about analytics already. I mean, it makes sense they ultimately hired Sam. And they had Barzilay, they had him run like a statistical analysis over the past decade. I mean, the Sixers were actually, ironically, pretty good drafters, right? Before this, they picked Andre Iguodala in ninth. They got Thad Young late. They got Drew Holiday in the teens. Vucevic, didn't play there long, but they got him in the teams. And look what he's become. Lou Williams in the second round, Kyle Korver, Willie Green, whatever. They had a pretty long draft history. So sure enough, the statistical data spits back out that the Sixers have had the best draft ratio for like success from draft slots, like the highest win shares per pick. Probably guys like Lou Williams help, And so the Sixers will always draft. During that process, they would get all their scouts together. They make their big board 1 through 60, 1 through 100, whatever. They would tweak it a couple times, and then as the draft just came up, they would just take the guy at the top of their board. So it worked through and through and through. And when Sam got hired, there were still a lot of those people still around. So when he starts to come into play in May, only a month before the draft, he is starting to engage in those conversations with people, but he's not ever telling them his opinion. He's only asking questions. And the old guys are starting to look around like, why is he not telling us what he thinks? And, he's going into his office door with his guy, Sachin Gupta, who he brings in from Houston, and they're kind of working all night. And everyone else is kind of hanging around, like wondering whether or not they can leave or not. He comes out his door sometimes and says, "Oh, why didn't you guys go home?" And they're like, "Well, you didn't tell us to leave." So when the draft comes around that Wednesday, he called in Courtney Whitty, their longtime director of player personnel, and Rod Thorne, the former president, handed them 2 binders and said, this was like the Wednesday afternoon before the draft or that Thursday before the draft, that afternoon, and said, "We're trading Drew Holiday if Nerlens Noel is still available at number 6. Don't tell anybody." And throughout that night, they would sit in that private room of Hinkie's office. It was separated by a door, like a adjoining hotel room. And they would have someone come in and call somebody to like see the Don in the back room throughout the draft night and say, "Hey, you were really evaluating, this player. What do you tell us about him?" And they would send him back out there. And, we know that famous picture of Joe Dumars on 2 cell phones. I was told that Hinkie was talking into a landline and a mobile phone. And, in that night, he was this big negotiating guy. He ran all these deals. And the best story to cap all this up is someone told me to give insight to this negotiating style he did. Because, he made like 5 trades in that second round. Back in college, Sam Hinkie in Oklahoma as an undergrad studying business, he had to fulfill a negotiation requirement. So he called and ordered 50 pizzas. This is what the legend says. This giant filled lecture hall, 100 people, whatever. This little guy, pizza delivery guy, comes in with all the pizzas, and Sam Hinkie successfully negotiated to get all those pizzas for free in front of that entire room. So that is where I leave you.
All right, great stuff. Jake Fisher, the author of the book, is called Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League, and really the Sixers forever. It's the team now that many people were apathetic about for their whole lives, and now they care about losing on Tuesday night in February on the road in Cleveland because it wrecks their whole week. It's like an Eagles loss, almost. That is what Sam Hinkie really created for the Sixers. Good or bad, I don't know. The Twitter world would say that it's very toxic, but for what I do, and it created a book for you, Jake. I appreciate you coming on, and it's good to see you, man.
You too, man. Thanks for having me.
Ventnor Beach, man. We'll see you down there.
For sure. Have a good one.
Jake Fisher. The book is called Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. You can get your copy now on pre-order. It publishes May the 4th. I appreciate him jumping on board right there.